Therefore, Tay Huang, he's a professor at Yonsei University, and he got his PhD from University of Rochester. He's one of the leading experts on sanctions. And Stephan Haggard is talking about, he will include some of technical aspects of sanctions. And then I invited Professor Huang to give a comment, on the STEP's presentation as a way of opening to open discussion, among ourselves. Okay, Steph, Fala.
Thanks very much. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming. Changyan, as he said, we've been friends for about 30 years. One thing he didn't tell you is I wrote my first academic article co-authored with him. So that's how far back we go.
That article landed him the professor job at Harvard.
Well, so he thinks. So anyway, I was going to talk about a book which is currently in press at Stanford University Press on how sanctions work. And actually, Changyan mischaracterized my position. I don't argue that sanctions work. I argue that neither sanctions nor inducements tend to work with regimes like North Korea. But I thought that today what I would do was not talk about that book, but talk about where we are currently. Because I think that some very interesting things are going on, not only with the defections, but with the kind of precarious nature of the North Korean economy. And I don't think that we've thought very seriously about how a sanctions crisis might actually unfold with respect to North Korea. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time looking at some economic issues surrounding the North Korean economy and how it might be vulnerable to sanctions. And then I want to talk about THAAD, because THAAD, I think, has fundamentally changed the political dynamics on the peninsula by altering where China's thinking about sanctions is. And then I want to suggest some very slim possibility outs for how the three parties, the United States, China, and South Korea, might get around what North Korea is doing. Because what North Korea is doing is extremely clever in dividing the United States from China, from South Korea, and South Korea from China. And I think their diplomacy in some way, including their missile development program, is really has a strategic political objective, and we have to look at exactly what that is. So I want to start with actually a different case. I want to go back to Iran, because we think of North Korea as being a small, closed economy, but increasingly it's actually a small, open economy. And I'll explain what I mean by that, but obviously North Korea is very integrated and dependent on China, and because of that, it's actually more exposed, I think, to sanctions than it's been in a long time. But the question is, how would those sanctions actually unfold? And if you look back, if you look at some of this data, which I'm going to show you 4 slides on Iran. It's actually quite revealing about how sanctions work, because our model of how they work typically is that the sanctions squeeze particular sectors, and therefore those sectors respond by saying we can't operate under this environment, and that somehow puts pressure on the government. But in small open economies, the way that sanctions work is they actually have an effect on the exchange rate. And that's really clear in the Iranian case. And the reason that's important is because the exchange rate affects every single price in the economy. So this is data. Steve Hanka has collected a lot of data on the black market exchange rates of a number of distressed countries. And this shows you the path of the official exchange rate in Iran and the black market exchange rate after the sanctions started to bite, and particularly after the negotiations that led to the imposition of oil sanctions against Iran. And what you can see here is this dramatic depreciation in the exchange rate fairly quickly following the imposition of those sanctions. Ultimately, the regime was constrained to announce a formal devaluation of the exchange rate. And what's interesting is this period in here there's a lot of drama in this period, because prior to the election of Rouhani in July of 2013, the US had already started negotiations with the Iranians in Oman as a result of the pressures that the Iranians were feeling as a result of the depreciation of the exchange rate. Now, part of that depreciation of the exchange rate was associated with this dramatic increase in inflation. Look at these annualized inflation rates in Iran, peaking at around 200%, but even at the time of sanctions, prior to the imposition of sanctions, running at over 100% a year. And then you see that once these negotiations start and you get the devaluation of the exchange rate, then inflation moderates quite substantially. So I don't want to draw a perfect parallel between North Korea and Iran, obviously, but I think we're not thinking correctly about the way in which sanctions might have effect. Everything looks fine until it's not fine. In other words, this doesn't happen gradually. It's very possible that North Korea is subject to a kind of crisis circumstance, as you see here, both in the unofficial exchange rate and then ultimately in the devaluation of the exchange rate in early 2013. So what I want to do is I want to paint a case for why North Korea is vulnerable to such a sudden crisis. And I should add from the headlines that the defections that we're seeing add to this risk, particularly if these individuals are taking significant foreign exchange out of the North Korean orbit. And the defection of the ambassadors may be less significant than the defection of any operatives that are working with Office 39 and may have accounts under their control, which is going to significantly reduce the ability of North Korea to import from the rest of the world, including from China. Because obviously, North Korea has to pay for the exports that China ships to North Korea. That is, it has to finance its current account deficit. Okay. So let me just run through a couple of features of the North Korean economy that I think some of you know, but it's worth keeping in mind. First of all, the state sector is moribund. It's just really not performing. We have BOK data on this, which no one really trusts. I hope there's no one here from the Bank of Korea here. They do the best job they can. But this data probably is most relevant to understanding what's going on in the state sector. And I'll talk about the informal economy shortly. But as you can see, growth by these measures has basically been flat, except for 1 year, 2008, where there was a bit of recovery. I mean, growth between 2006 and the present is basically zero. I mean, this is an economy which is stagnant. I mean, you hear all this stuff about the informal sector, but when you look at these larger measures which are based on output of the state sector, it's clear that the North Korean economy is not doing very well. And I'll talk about the informal sector because that's important. I just want to say a word about agriculture. I don't know what happened there. It looks like that's missing. But the food situation is still uncertain. There's a 300,000 metric ton uncovered deficit for this year. That means that the North Koreans have got to import about 300,000 metric tons. And they have to finance those imports because the Chinese are not giving food to the North Koreans, at least as far as we can tell. So they have to generate adequate foreign exchange earnings to cover these needs. And the big thing is the dependence on China. And this is stated frequently, but I want to emphasize how significant this has become. So this is a table which I use frequently going back to our discussion of the six-party talks, which looks at the total trade with the five parties. And there's a lot in here, but the first thing to note is if you go back to 2000, I mean, this is really striking. If you go back to 2000, the share of Japan, Korea, and China in North Korea's trade was about equal. It was about 20%. And if you add this up, you can see that with 20% here and with the US at zero and the Russia at very low levels, North Korea was trading significantly with the rest of the world. I mean, it had 35 or 40% of its trade was with what we call ROW, rest of the world, right? But look what's happened since the onset of the crisis. What's happened since the onset of the crisis is this relentless increase in North Korea's dependence on China. Obviously, the South Korean share has been influenced by the strategies of the liberal and conservative governments. When Lee Myung-bak comes to office, you see this decline in trade, quite obviously, as aid is cut and Kaesong is left as the most important bit left. And then you see there's a little downturn in the share of China's trade in 2014-15 and an increase in South Korea's share. But remember, this is all Kaesong, and in 2016, Kaesong is gone. So, this is a major vulnerability, and not only because of the trade, but because of the end of the cash payments which are associated with the Kaesong complex. I mean, this is basically trucks of cash being driven into Kaesong and deposited in North Korean entities that basically help finance its balance of payments deficit, including, again, with China. Okay? I mean, that's an important point. Kaesong is paying in part for the China current account deficit because the Kaesong trade is basically balanced. South Korea exports products partially processed to Kaesong. There's some value added in Kaesong and it comes back. But North Korea isn't importing anything else from South Korea. It's using those earnings to finance its trade with the rest of the world and with China. That's gone. That's gone. Okay? And then these are shares, but when you look at the trend in the China-North Korea trade, it's also been trending down. And one of the features about the North Korean economy that I think isn't fully appreciated is that over the last 10 years, it's actually become like a rentier state because its export economy has depended increasingly on raw materials. Now, we've seen some increase in export processing out of Rasan, primarily in sectors such as textiles and apparel. But basically, and I use this phrase advisedly, North Korea has become like a hunter-gatherer economy. It's maritime products, coal, steel, ores. And that has big implications because we know from a pretty substantial comparative politics literature that economies like this are vulnerable to corruption, they're vulnerable to predation, they're not competitive, they're subject to all of the pressures that come from the Dutch disease and so on. And I don't think we think of North Korea as a mineral processing and exporting country, but that's actually what it's become. And part of the downturn in trade with China is, number one, the slowdown in the Chinese economy, but the other thing that's happening is the end of the commodity super cycle where prices in commodities, which had been high up until the last 3 or 4 years, have started to fall, and North Korea is vulnerable to that shock. Okay, so let me turn to the rest of the world because again, this is just an accounting issue. If you add this up, you can see what the story is. I mean, 65, 70, this is going to go back to 80% of North Korea's trade is with China. The South Korean share is going to fall to 0. What does that mean for the rest of the world? It means that there's nothing except probably services. And by services, I mean increasingly the export of labor. This has become one of the main adjustment strategies of the North Korean economy, is to export labor. And that labor export is getting squeezed in Europe on human rights grounds and elsewhere because the US and other democratic countries are putting pressure on importers of North Korean labor to shut these operations down. And again, for those of you who studied economics in college or remember it, what this is showing is this is the trade deficit with the rest of the world. So these are the deficits which North Korea was able to run. And if you go back to this early period, they were running deficits, trade deficits with the rest of the world, which means that those deficits were financed somewhere. All of that is dried up. There's nothing. And it's down to 0. I mean, North Korea is incapable of trading with the rest of the world. And that's partly because of sanctions, it's partly because of lack of competitiveness. But this is an economy which there's just not much left with the rest of the world. I mean, they've basically thrown their lot with China. And China, I think, quite strategically has sought to incorporate North Korea into its orbit in a way which maximizes its potential leverage. But as I'll show, they haven't been willing to exercise it. Now, in the past, North Korea has done a surprisingly good job in adjusting to the sanctions regimes against it. Illicit activities were one way of doing that. A number of people have tracked North Korean illicit activities, which include drugs, counterfeiting of $100 bills, counterfeiting of cigarettes, and so on. When those were shut down, the invitation to the Chinese to invest in mining operations became a critical feature of North Korea's adjustment. And I date this to around 2008. But already at the end of the Hu Jintao era, you had, China basically opening the door for Chinese investors to go into North Korea. And that investment was, again, both financing the country's deficits and also contributing to its exports by generating mining revenues and coal revenues in particular. Now, Kaesong is closed. UN Security Council Resolution 2270 has, in principle, shut off coal exports, and I'll show you that that hasn't, in fact, occurred. And then this story, which I think has gotten lost in the recent press, is that the United States has instituted secondary sanctions, or is in the process of implementing secondary sanctions against North Korea, by demanding that foreign banks exercise due diligence, that is, foreign banks who want to do business with the United States, that they exercise due diligence with respect to North Korean accounts. Which means basically that, where does North Korea bank? I mean, this is really an interesting issue. I mean, there are some small banks that are located at the city level in China that are probably taking North Korean accounts. And they're using Chinese Koreans to have, own name accounts that are in fact North Korean but are held by Chinese citizens. But basically, the squeeze on North Korea's capacity to bank in the rest of the world is really getting serious. And I suspect that at least some of the problems that you're seeing in the foreign ministry are that foreign ministry officials are being called on to generate foreign exchange for the regime, and they can't figure out how to do it. Because there's no place, you can't make money out of nothing. You can't just print it. You have to have some means of investing or exporting and so forth, and all of these channels are being squeezed off. So again, remember, the core point about financial crises, as Korea well knows from 1997, is everything is fine until it's not fine. It doesn't happen slowly, it happens quickly. It was a couple of weeks in October when South Korea fell apart in 1997. It took a week. And I think we have to be thinking about a North Korea that could collapse in this way. It's not political collapse. It would be something resembling an old-fashioned financial crisis. So, now, what is actually happening? Let me just tell you how these balance of payments crises work first, because if you're not familiar with them, we understand how they work. I mean, this isn't something I'm making up. We have 50 years of balance of payments crises. We know the mechanisms through which they operate. We know exactly how they operate. But basically, as a result of either trade or financial shocks, you get this pressure on the exchange rate. And in fixed rate systems, that happens by the central bank having to release reserves to maintain the exchange rate. We have no idea how North Korean central banking works. But in North Korea, it's going to happen through a depreciation in the black market exchange rate. Because effectively, the economy is probably something like half dollarized. And by dollarized, I mean yuanized and euroized, and half on on the won, the North Korean won, but dollarization does not reduce the risk for countries like this because there are plenty of households in North Korea who still have income in North Korean won. And if you get this kind of depreciation, everything that's imported, everything, prices including of food, and households still rely significantly on the market for food, is going to go up. And particularly if you've got difficulties in importing grain. You've already seen, for those of you who follow North Korea, you've already seen this rhetoric of self-sufficiency re-emerging, old-fashioned juche, we need to be self-reliant, we need to be self-sufficient. That is not an ideological line. That's a recognition of the fact that North Korea is facing a difficulty in securing imports. And then you've seen, again, these small things that many of you might notice. You've seen new regulations issued last month on foreign currency in the economic development zones. It used to be that you could go into a bank in Rasan and change currency at the black market exchange rate. And Pyongyang knew that. That was allowed. No more. I mean, the center is scrambling for dollars. It wants to get its hands on dollars, and it's going to be continuing to try to institute controls on black market activity in order to secure adequate foreign exchange for itself. Because if you and I are traders in a market, and you're a private person and I'm a private person, and we're exchanging dollars for North Korean won, the government is not in on that. It doesn't have any access to that foreign exchange. It needs access to foreign exchange. And that's what Bureau 39 is about. That's what the exports are about. All of that is one big pot, which is the foreign exchange which the regime has available at its disposal, not only to handle the economy, but to handle the rents that are associated with keeping loyalty within the regime. Now, I could talk a little bit about the prospects for inflation, the bursting of asset bubbles, because there's this sort of property boom in Pyongyang. Asset prices are increasing, but I want to show you a slide which most of us who work on the North Korean economy has spent all our time basically trying to figure out what's going on. Okay? So let me spend a little time on this because this is the current mystery, the deep mystery of the North Korean economy. So most of you know that in 2009 there was this disastrous currency conversion. But what a lot of people don't realize is that in the aftermath of that currency conversion in 2009, the North Korean economy went through a period of what we call near inertial inflation, very high inflation, from 2009 to about 2012, middle of 2012. And you just see this very steady increase in prices, and the two prices that are reflected here are the US dollar exchange rate and the won price of rice. And by the way, I have a theory about why Kim Jong-un actually was a reformer and then ultimately did not prove to be a reformer. Because unfortunately, after the death of his father, he stepped into a situation in which prices were rising very dramatically in North Korea. And we have some colleagues here from Eastern Europe who remember those transitional processes when you broke in Bulgaria, and then you had this very high increase in prices immediately following the transition. And Kim Jong-un is coming into office, and he's trying to institute some pilot reforms, but because of this long-standing inertial push, all he's seeing is rising prices. And that's very difficult circumstances our Bulgarian colleagues know to undertake reforms, because the reforms don't look like they're working, they look like they're creating more inflation, right? Sometime around the 2012, the end of 2012, North Korea figured out how to stabilize its economy. And since that time, what's surprising is that inflation has moderated, prices have moderated, the exchange rate has moderated, And everyone's trying to figure out how they did this. No one can figure it out. I mean, it's really the true puzzle, because what you would expect, given all these vulnerabilities, is that, in fact, you would see a further process like we saw in this post-currency conversion process. And this is the most recent period, and the most important thing to note for our purposes here is that following the imposition of UN Security Council Resolution 2270, which in principle prohibited North Korean exports of coal, there's been no change in the $1 exchange rate. You've got to be kidding me. This is 35% of the country's exports. It's just not possible. It doesn't make any sense, as we saw from the Iran case, right? So the only possible interpretation of this, I hate to say, and I don't know if any of our colleagues here are Chinese, is that the Chinese really have decided that they're not interested in implementing these sanctions for reasons which we can talk about, and they have to do with us as well as China. But I think this pretty much tells the story, even though the data is very recent, so this is 2270, coal exports, which under 2270 are supposed to be prescribed, they basically haven't changed whatsoever. And to me, the rest of 2270 doesn't make any difference. I mean, yeah, commercial shipping and all of that is significant. But if China were to get serious about coal, one product, it's pretty clear that North Korea would have to come back to the bargaining table quickly. And China is aware of that. And that gets us into the final topic, which I'm going to talk about briefly so we can have a discussion, which is the politics of this. And what's going on between the United States, South Korea, and China, in my humble opinion. Okay? So, 2270 was a big surprise to everyone. I mean, when I read that resolution, I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was just surprising that the Chinese would go so far. I mean, it was a very extensive resolution, and it had, the aviation fuel, shipping, finance, a whole series of things. But one provision of that resolution on coal would have made the entire difference, because I said you're talking about a third of North Korea's export earnings. But the negotiations over that resolution involved 3 exemptions with respect to coal. The first was the Russian exemption, allowing the Russians to continue to export coal out of Rosan. And 2 other exemptions, which I don't think the Americans, frankly, paid too much attention to. I think the Chinese out-negotiated us on this. The 2 other exemptions are what's called a livelihood exemption. That is an exemption which permits exports from North Korea as long as they would, cutting them off, would adversely affect the livelihood of the exporters, and a provision requiring that any exports, the effects of any exports, be traced back to the WMD programs, the missile and nuclear programs. But guys, I mean, the purpose of sanctions is to impose costs on people's livelihoods. And so if you simply say, we're going to invoke this livelihood exemption, you're saying that you're not serious about imposing the sanctions. Okay? Now, how did the U.S. respond to this? Initially, I think the United States was upset that the Chinese were not willing to talk openly about the sanctions regime, that is, to hold serious discussions. But when Kerry went to Beijing and met with Wang Yi, if you read that press conference closely, Kerry basically takes a fairly relaxed stance on this issue. And I think the U.S. calculation was, and I have this secondhand, not firsthand, is that the United States would essentially trust the Chinese to implement these sanctions at their discretion. Because the objective of the United States, despite the fact that some people think differently, is not to force a collapse of the North Korean regime. The objective of the United States is to put adequate pressure on the country so we can get the 6-party talks started again. So basically what Kerry said to Wang Yi is, look, we're going to follow your lead. We're not going to make a stink about these sanctions. We'd like to coordinate with you on some issues, but we sort of trust that you will implement these sanctions as they're outlined in 2270. And it's pretty clear that the Chinese haven't been doing that, and so it's not, to come back to my debate with Chung-In, it's not that the sanctions don't work, it's that we're back in a world in which in which the Chinese are not interested in imposing sanctions. And if China is willing to prop up the North Korean economy, then guess what? Why should the North Koreans go back to the bargaining table? There's no reason to. So now that takes us to THAAD, because THAAD is in my view a fateful decision, and I want to say this part of my talk is a little bit more speculative because I'm still trying to think this through for myself about how we should be approaching the THAAD issue. But the one point I want to make is that the decision to deploy doesn't mean that this system has to be deployed. And I want to talk about some reasons why we might want to think about the diplomacy surrounding THAAD deployment a little bit more carefully. I understand President Park's pique, her disaffection with China following the fourth test, because as we know, you all know the story, she tried to get a hold of Xi Jinping, she couldn't make contact, it was weeks before he got back, and the Chinese are saying, well, no one should upset the balance on the peninsula. What do you mean no one should upset the balance on the peninsula? They just undertook a fourth test. What are we talking about? And then on missiles, I'll say a few things about those as well. Okay, so let me unfold this argument in several steps first, and then see what you think. So the first point I want to make is, in my view, as a strategic issue and an ethical issue, a moral issue, the United States and the ROK have absolutely every right to deploy THAAD. There's no reason why we should be subject to a veto by the Chinese or anyone else over the deployment of THAAD. And let me just remind you of the developments under Kim Jong-un, because one thing I've seen in the strategic community, and I'm not a missile person, I'm more of a political economy person, but the US and the South Koreans have consistently underestimated North Korea's capacity to develop its missile program. So this list is familiar to everyone. The second satellite launch, the rollout or announcement of a second generation, though untested ICBM, the Musudan test, which by the way was treated as a short test, which didn't fully exploit the range of that missile, but we now know that that was because it was at a steep, lofted trajectory. And where did it land? It landed in the Japanese EEZ, guys. I mean, come on. I mean, this is not the status quo. You've got North Korea dropping missiles in Japan's exclusive economic zone. You've got the underwater launch of an SLBM, which looks like a Soviet SSN-6. You've got this big investment in a submarine facility. You've got indigenous air defense missile tests. You've got a whole series of static tests that are related to the missile program. And then you've got maybe a mock-up of an implosion nuclear weapon, but they said that the Musudans were mock-ups, remember. And they weren't mock-ups, they just tested it. And then you've got the announced resumption of both reprocessing and enrichment that was announced by the North Koreans to the Japanese press 2 weeks ago. So I want to emphasize, as my first point, that the US and the ROK are fully justified, in my view, in deploying THAAD if they choose to do so. So the question is it strategically wise to do so? And to answer that question, I think we have to understand what the North Koreans are doing. Because I think that the missile and nuclear program are not only serving a strategic purpose and an internal political purpose for the North Korean regime, but they're also serving a strategic political purpose in shifting the game between the US, South Korea, and China and North Korea in a way which is advantageous to North Korea. I mean, they see the benefits of THAAD for them. Because THAAD deployment means that the Chinese are upset with the United States instead of being upset with the North Koreans. And, I mean, we've seen this game for years, right? I mean, Chung-Yin and I have been watching this. I mean, this is standard, okay? So, let me just go through what the nuclear and missile program has, what it's done. So here's what THAAD does. It generates wedges between the US and China, where relations are already bad, by the way, because of the South China Sea. And when I say bad, I mean they're as bad as I've seen them in a long time. I mean, US-China relations are just not good, period. And it's the South China Sea, it's the Senkaku Diaoyus, it's the Korean Peninsula. I mean, it's everywhere, right? I mean, it's not, relations are not good. And this makes them worse, obviously. It's had the effect of pushing China and Russia together. This is what could be worse than having these two large powers that don't really have particularly close relations are coming together and saying, we have a common interest against the U.S. and the Asia Pacific. It's generating wedges between the ROC and China. Quite obviously, you guys know those. It's generating internal conflicts in South Korea over policy. And most importantly, and I think we're really on the verge of being too late for this, is that Beijing is just no longer has any interest in cooperating with the United States and South Korea on this issue in a serious fashion. I mean, THAAD has succeeded in alienating China from assisting South Korea and the United States with respect to North Korea. What could be better for North Korea? I mean, this is your ideal situation, right? Your patron is forced back into supporting you and taking stances against the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Americans as a result of North Korea's missile and nuclear development. I mean, come on, we're getting played. We really are. I mean, I think we're getting played, and we really have to think very hard about how to respond to this. So let me just say something about U.S. policy about ballistic missile defense, but let me start with an observation, and this is probably the one that Chung-Yin and I disagree on the most. So Chung-Yin, pay attention. So he's heard this before. So look, I think it's possible that we're in a world in which North Korea has absolutely no intention of negotiating on its nuclear program. None. And, Chung-Yin and I disagreed with this. In the late Kim Jong-il period, I think it was a flip of the coin, Chung-Yin argued, no, they're willing to negotiate, and I was saying, well, I don't really see the evidence, we could have the argument. But I think under Kim Jong-un, it's become so central to the regime. The missile and nuclear programs are becoming so central to his domestic legitimation strategy. From the Moranbong ban to social media, it's missiles and nuclear weapons. That's who Kim Jong-un is. That's what he's about. We may have gotten so far that it's really very difficult to entertain a serious negotiation, and we can talk about what a serious negotiation is. And if that's the case, then we're in a containment world. And by the way, I mean, if you think U.S. policy is as hard as it can get, it's not. If you want to see what a Clinton administration will look like, and it will be a Clinton administration, you can look at Wendy Sherman's speech at the CSIS earlier in the year, in which basically she says, look, negotiation's pointless, we just have to limit the damage. Because North Korea is going to experience distress, and we should be talking to the Chinese about a collapse. Which I disagree with, by the way, but in Sherman's speech, there's no mention of the six-party talks. And this is a woman who could become Secretary of State, not just managing Korea affairs. And she doesn't even make mention of the six-party talks. This is a policy speech at the CSIS in Washington. There's no mention of the six-party talks. So
she talked five-party talks.
Huh?
Five-party talks.
Five-party talks,
Five-party
other
coalitions.
bilateral talks and so forth. No mention of the six-party talks. This is a potential American official. It's been a cornerstone of U.S. policy that the six-party talk option is there. And by the way, of South Korean policy as well. So here's what I think. I think the way out of this is extremely narrow. But, and so I don't have much confidence that this will take place. But I really think that the way forward is that China, the U.S., and South Korea have got to figure out some way to enhance trilateral cooperation around this issue. Because if not, North Korea is going to basically get its way. Because the more tension there is between South Korea and China and the U.S. and China, the more North Korea is protected, both economically and strategically, and the less likelihood there is that it's going to give up its nuclear weapons program. So what do I mean by that? I mean two tracks, and I know Chang'an will like this part, and it's hard for me to say this, but I think we need to encourage China to articulate more clearly, with more granular detail, the nature of this Wang Yi proposal of February 17th to undertake some kind of combined peace regime nuclear negotiation. Because right now, at least to me, maybe there are South Korean officials in the room who have seen exactly what the Chinese proposal is. But to date, I have never seen a clear statement of exactly how these negotiations would take place. Now, I want to hear what you have to say, but obviously the United States is not going to sit down and have peace regime negotiations with North Korea when it's undertaking all of this nuclear development. It's not going to happen. But it's not impossible for the United States to entertain some kind of negotiating format that would include all issues, or perhaps two separate tracks of negotiation, one devoted to the peace regime, one devoted to nuclear weapons. But if China can't get North Korea to discuss the nuclear issue, then again, from the perspective of South Korea and the United States, China's just not serious about this issue. They're not serious about the issue. And so I think one test or one entreaty to the Chinese is put on the table a more detailed version of the February proposal that Wang Yi made, and tell the Chinese that if you can get the North Koreans to come, then the U.S. and the South Koreans will show up. What do I think the likelihood of this is? 2%. Okay? But I think that, you should never give up on diplomacy. You should never give up on it. Now, my views on THAAD are a little bit more complicated, and I'll do this last little bit and then I'll stop. But let me just be clear on some mythology here. U.S. policy since 2010 on ballistic missile defense in Asia was, following the 2010 Ballistic Missile Defense Review, was defined as a phased adaptive approach. And that term is typical Pentagon speak, but what it means is that the U.S. would deploy ballistic missile defenses as they were necessary given the threats. We don't have an intrinsic interest in BMD. It's just not true. I mean, we want BMD for a particular purpose because they're threats which the U.S. faces. And the threats are primarily North Korean. Now, we can talk about whether that's a disingenuous posture on the part of the United States. Now, I know that the Chinese and Russians have concerns about the integration of theater ballistic missile defenses, and I think that's a serious issue. But the United States is, our policy is that this deployment of BMD is targeted at threats. It's not, the purpose is not to contain China or contain Russia. And in fact, if you look at U.S. strategic posture, it has always accepted mutual vulnerability with both Russia and China. The United States cannot defend itself against nuclear attack from either Russia or China, and it doesn't want to defend itself against strategic nuclear attack from those two countries, because in the paradox of nuclear weapons, it's the mutual vulnerability of the two sides that guarantees the stability. That's what we mean by nuclear stability. Defenses are destabilizing, right? Because they trigger arms races and they trigger efforts on both sides to defend. So I think that what the US needs to do is to reiterate that THAAD is contingent on the development of North Korean capabilities, and that the US and South Korea should be willing to discuss THAAD with the Chinese in the context of the Chinese doing something about North Korea. Because if the Chinese are unwilling to do anything about North Korea, why should we discuss that? It makes no sense. I mean, the US and South Korea have to defend themselves. It's perfectly legitimate for us to do so. But it's also perfectly legitimate for us to say to the Chinese that if we can make progress on scaling back, reducing, eliminating the North Korean nuclear and missile threat, then there's no reason for us to deploy that. And I think that's a narrow window, but I think it's one that we should take very seriously. And I'm going to carry that message to our colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Unification today. So the fact that the decision to deploy has been made does not mean that we can't consider ways in which we communicate with our Chinese and Russian colleagues on trying to solve the problem on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, I think I'll stop. I talked too long, but we're going on vacation shortly at Witness to Transformation, but if you don't know about the blog, I urge you to take a look. There's a lot of material up there that we post daily on various aspects of the Korean Peninsula, and I look forward to your questions.